Nobody could believe what they had seen, bursting out from beneath the sea as it made its way back to the island. Just when the residents of Aranirum had thought it was safe, that their troubles were a thing of the past, the sight of an enormous, radioactive Choo Choo Charles was now crawling out of the water to come and wreak his revenge on the islanders. The monster let out a shrill, piercing cry, one that almost sounded like a train whistle, but was now distorted, made into an unnatural shriek. Charles was huge, easily 10 times his original size, with huge spider legs scratching at the coast as he pulled himself ashore. The few islanders who were brave enough, or foolish enough, to try and defend against Charles were quickly met with a new horror. They stood at a ridge, firing or throwing whatever weapons they had, only for Choo Choo Charles to suddenly take notice and turn towards them. He opened up his mouth, lined with rows of razor-sharp teeth the size of tombstones, and a blast of bright green fire erupted from within. He was channeling the heat from his steam engine body into a powerful beam of radioactive energy that left nothing standing. Watching from a distance, Paul hurriedly tinkered in his workshop, welding as quickly as he could. It was almost ready. He just hoped he could create it in time, and that it would be enough to stop Charles for good. Choo Choo Charles had been defeated, and the island of Aranirum was safe from the terrifying, train-wielding tarantula-like monster. The islanders, once unable to leave their homes out of fear of Choo Choo Charles, could now breathe a collective sigh of relief. The nightmare was over. Or at least, so they thought, and naively hoped. Of course, every monster has its reign of terror, and has its time to die, but even an evil that is dead can sometimes rise again. It hadn't been long since Charles's apparent demise. Those living on the island had been working together to repair most of the damage left to their home by the battle with the demonic spider train. Rubble and debris didn't clear itself, but fortunately, the residents of Aranirum were a tight-knit community. Working together, they knew they could have their island back to the way it was in no time at all. Then came the sound. They had all heard it coming from miles away, the nose of blades whooshing through the air. Every one of the people left on the island noticed it. It was a far cry from the stomping of giant spider legs and the shrill, piercing toot of a train whistle. It was coming from above, heading straight for them. A trio of helicopters broke through the clouds above, their swirling rotors clearing the looming dark formation still hanging over Aranirum. The islanders turned to look at the aircraft beginning to descend, stopping what they were doing, dropping tools or putting down heavy debris. Not one of them had ever expected to see helicopters touching down on their remote, quiet island. The 3 choppers landed, 2 smaller single-rotor ones and one much larger, with twice as many propellers, and what looked like some kind of heavy-duty winch and cable attached to its underbelly. Striding out of the aircraft came a swarm of people. Some were wearing dark, plain suits, nothing to identify who they were or where they'd come from. No badges, name tags, anything. The rest had on hazmat gear, protecting their bodies from, well, it wasn't clear. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of all of us, we'd like to extend our heartfelt gratitude for what you've done here today. In order for normality to resume, we'll be taking direct control of the situation, including the removal and disposal of any hazardous materials. The residents all exchanged a series of uncertain looks. Nobody had any idea who these new arrivals were, or what they were up to. "Who's us?" Someone suddenly called from the crowd. It was Paul, a young man who lived on Aranirum. His father, Eugene, had been the one who came up with the plan to defeat Choo Choo Charles and had given his life to set it in motion. "Just an interested party, son. Don't worry, this will all be over soon. We'll take this big dead critter off your hands and be out of your hair in no time." The man seemed to be deliberately avoiding the question, using evasive language to dodge having to give a definitive answer. Were they working for Warren Charles III? The wealthy mining company owner had only just perished, but he and his loyal crew had worshipped Charles. Had Warren Charles III sent for these newcomers so they could retrieve the half-train, half-gigaspider's remains for some nefarious person? Or was this shadowy group something else? "Now, I'm sure you all got lots to do, huts to repair and such. You leave this big fella to us. Oh, and one more thing, ladies and gentlemen. We'd appreciate it if you didn't interfere. For your own sake." And with that, the shadowy figures descended on what was left of Choo Choo Charles. They set about examining, taking readings, making notes, and urging the residents of Aranirum to leave. It took the secretive team less than a week to get everything they needed. They had done a sweep of the entire island, gathering up various ancient stone tablets that detailed Charles's true form and his monstrous nature. anything related to or referencing the species of gigantic, spider-like creatures that had once roamed Aranerum was taken by shady agents, including all that remained of the spidery species. Deep underground, hidden away within the caverns beneath the island, there were hundreds of dormant monster eggs. The figures in hazmat suits brought in devices to spray the eggs with a special substance that kept them frozen and in a stable state for transport. Then, they latched the high-tensile strength cable from their large twin-rotor chopper to the body of Choo Choo Charles. An enormous tarpaulin had been affixed to the terror of Aranerum, keeping his remains obscured from view as the helicopter hoisted it up into the air. But as they watched, the islanders knew what was happening. Someone was taking Choo Choo Charles away to goodness knows where. It would be as though he had never existed, never caused havoc across the island. As for where the secretive group was taking him, nobody had even the faintest clue. Some were glad that the nightmare of Choo Choo Charles seemed to have subsided, out of sight and out of mind, but they had no idea just how wrong they were. Following their orders from above, the recovery team flew Choo Choo Charles to an aircraft carrier that was moored not far from the coast of Aranerum, between there and the mainland. Once secured aboard, they brought the half-spider, half-train monstrosity to a secure, top-secret facility aboard the ship. Now, the testing could begin. Scientists and paranormal experts studied the remains of the creature, performing all manner of tests on it in order to better understand it. While they had refused to interfere when Charles was terrorizing Aranerum, they had been keeping a close eye on the creature. They knew he had a similar physiology to a spider and could move incredibly fast on his multiple legs, and his ability to absorb energy, along with his outer metal shell, gave Charles an incredible endurance against damage. That was a quality they were eager to try and replicate. However, there was only so much they could learn now that Choo Choo Charles had already been defeated, so the direction of their tests shifted slightly. In order to get better results, they needed to bring the steam engine sporting spider back from the dead, a decision that would spell doom for everyone. Placing the remains of Choo Choo Charles in a secure, specially designed chamber right in the heart of the vessel, the agents all retreated to a safe distance. The chamber was designed to bombard a test subject with lethal doses of nuclear radiation, the same level as released by an atomic bomb, but without the need for detonation. Agents and scientists alike gathered behind the safety of layers upon layers of thick walls designed to contain all the excess radiation. Then, someone pushed the big red button, and, for a moment, there was nothing, just an awful, chilling silence as everyone wondered what had happened. Then came an awful, eardrum-splitting scraping noise. Deep within the chamber, long, spidery legs were lurching, moving once more after being still for so long. They scratched at the surface of the surrounding room, while the rest of Choo Choo Charles lay still. Sensors are indicating minimal movement. It's most likely we triggered some involuntary reflexes, but we need to wait for the radiation to clear before we can take a look inside. Then hit it again. Give it another radiation dose, now. Following the command from the agent in charge, the button was pressed again, and once more, silence followed. But inside the chamber, the terror of Aranerum was stirring once more. The unnatural white, pupilless eyes of Choo Choo Charles opened up, veins now pumping with irradiated blood, giving them a green glow. Slowly, Charles clambered up on his spindly black limbs, radiation coursing through him, making the monstrous beast feel stronger than ever before. And soon, it began to show. The deafening noise of metal tearing echoed through the chamber as Charles's spidery body got bigger, buckling the steam train that formed his outer shell. As he grew, he began to swipe his strengthened spider legs, tearing through the walls of the chamber around him, like the metal was nothing more than wet paper. The ship's emergency alarm started to sound as Choo Choo Charles clawed his way out, ripping the boat to shreds. Water came pouring in, sweeping away the agents and scientists, while the angered half-train, half-gigaspider burst free, blasting radioactive fire from his mouth until it blasted a hole through the ship's hull. Climbing upwards, ripping his way through the lower decks, Choo Choo Charles came bursting out onto the top deck of the aircraft carrier, more irradiated fire spewing from his mouth and incinerating anyone trying to flee or abandon ship. Then, the steam engine sporting spider turned to scan the horizon. There it was. Home sweet home. The fearful residents of Aranerum had been watching from a distance. The carnivorous creature they thought to be vanquished had now burst out of an aircraft carrier and hurtled towards them through the water. Now, Choo Choo Charles had returned to Aranerum to exact his vengeance, but one of the islanders had been preparing. Uncertain that Charles was gone for good, Paul had been working on constructing something based on a series of blueprints his father had made. They were a backup plan, in case the heavily armored train wasn't enough to take down Charles for good. Slotting the vital components into place, Paul had done it. There was no time to admire his creation. He climbed aboard and threw a lever to activate it. Clambering over the shore and onto the island, the radiation-powered Charles was greeted with quite the sight. A mass of metal came bursting through the roof of Paul's workshop, reducing it to nothing more than rubble. Standing in the smithereens, though, was an enormous, steam-powered mech. Its body was the same heavily armed locomotive used to defeat Charles before, with arms and legs built from various other scrap found across the island. Controlling his creation from within the engine, Paul began a charge towards the radioactively resurrected Choo Choo Charles. The spider-legged nightmare rushed towards the mechanical Goliath, spewing more irradiated fire from his mouth. Paul reached for a control and maneuvered the mech's arm, which lifted and blasted Charles with its own fiery spray from a mounted flamethrower. Charles reared up on his hind legs and latched onto the mechanized warrior, digging his front 4 legs into its shoulders, severing the connections between them and the engine, where Paul was controlling the mech's limbs. The twisted, nightmarish grin of Choo Choo Charles leaned in closer, towering over Paul within his mech, as a green glow began building in the back of Charles's razor-toothed mouth. Opening wide, another blast of radioactive fire erupted from the enormous monster, and it didn't stop. The heat from the flames started to make the metal surface of the mech glow red-hot, melting it down into nothing more than a pile of scrap in only a few mere seconds. Paul was nowhere to be seen. All that was left was Choo Choo Charles, standing taller and more fearsome than ever. The few surviving islanders looked on in horror as the train monster let out a blood-curdling roar. Choo Choo Charles was reborn, and the nightmare had begun all over again.